Welcome back to biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske. We've been deep in the talks about evolution, and really we've worked our way up to the idea of Darwin and Darwin's theory of the mechanism behind evolution, and that's what we're going to pick up today, talking about how he unifies all these different theories that he has. So again, Darwin was influenced by a lot of different factors, but mostly from that Galapagos Islands and what he saw there. And he started to ask some really important questions, which you can see kind of appear here on the screen. And basically, what his theory is going to do is answer all three of those questions. So he's going to take all the different ideas that he has kind of learned through his time and the things that he's seen in his travels, and he's going to unify them into one theory, which he calls natural selection. And his idea of natural selection is based on four criteria. Number one, he recognizes that variations exist in every population, regardless of species. We can see that in humans, we can see it in dogs, we can see it in any species. So whether you realize that there are little differences or not, they're still there. And that some individuals, because of those differences, are better suited to survive in the environment that they live in currently than others, whether it be camouflage, speed, eyesight, sense of smell, whatever it is. That some of us have a little bit of differences, and they either give us an advantage or a disadvantage over the rest of the people in our population, over our competitors. And if I have traits that give me a better chance at survival, and I do survive, then I get to reproduce. And if I get to reproduce, I get to pass those traits off onto my offspring, and then they will have those traits, and they will survive and reproduce, and so on and so forth. And so over generations, over time, we start to see that those advantageous traits start to spread through the population because those are the ones that are reproducing and passing those traits on. And now we have lots of evidence, but the only evidence that Darwin had, other than his observations, was fossil records. But again, those are kind of hard to argue with, especially when they point to the same conclusion. But we have even more evidence now, which we'll talk about at the end. But in Darwin's time, he used fossils and the fossil record to prove that his theory of evolution and the mechanism behind evolution was correct. And so Darwin writes this book and comes up kind of with a concluding theory, which he calls modification by natural selection, in which he says that the environment is going to limit the growth of your population. There can only be so many deer, there can only be so many squirrels, there can only be so many hawks, whatever it may be. There's only so much food and space to go around. And so some of those organisms in that population have traits that make them better able to survive in that environment, and they reproduce and pass those traits on, like you just mentioned. So that's Darwin's theory. So he puts it all into this book. He writes this book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which you can still go pick up at your local bookstore or read out of your library. I have a nice hardbound edition at home, but you can even get it in paperback. Look at this bad boy. It's an interesting read. It's kind of a harder read just because of the language that he uses. Not necessarily like super scientific, but just like old English, but that's here or there. But believe it or not, so he writes this incredible book and comes up with these incredible conclusions, but he doesn't publish it right away. In fact, he has to be goaded into publishing it by his friends because he was a deeply religious man. And I think here at a private school in Indianapolis, we can respect the fact that there's a struggle a little bit sometimes between science and religion, and he had to internalize that, and he had to deal with that difficulty until he was finally able to publish that book. He was ridiculed and persecuted for his ideas, and he went through the rest of his life and died without necessarily getting the full respect for his theory and what it kind of did for the world of biology. So luckily for both him and for the rest of us, enough people paid attention to what he was saying that we were able to give him the respect that he so obviously deserves. So, one type of selection that we didn't talk about, we talked about artificial and natural, but there's one more type of selection that we should definitely cover, and that's sexual selection. And so artificial selection was when humans chose traits for the offspring of livestock and things like that. Natural selection is when the environment selects traits that give you a better chance of survival. But what about if you're just choosing traits of your mate just because you like them, because there's things that are appealing about those traits? Not necessarily that you give them a chance of survival, or not necessarily that they give the humans a benefit. Well, that's called sexual selection. In other words, like think about birds. Like birds choose a mate because of bright colors, or because of a song, or because of feathers and things like that. Those don't necessarily help them survive. There's just something that's appealing to the mate. And so that's what sexual selection is. So we see this in birds, we see it in rams and deer and moose and all kinds of different animals like that. And we see it in apes, like the alpha in the population is one that gets to mate with all the females in the population. Same was in wolves. In a lot of ways, we kind of see this in the human population as well, but we're not necessarily going to get into that right now. So let's talk more about natural selection. So Darwin's theory, widely accepted. People start to study it more, and we actually see that there are different types of natural selection that occur based on the type of trait that we're looking at. So there's stabilizing selection, where the average trait is best. There's directional, where you want to have one extreme or the other. And then there's disruptive, where both extremes are good. But what's going to happen there is that the population is actually going to be split into two populations and create different species. So let's take a look at 3 examples and let's see if we can identify which type of selection is occurring here. So we've got lizards in South America. And you can see they have different sizes of tails. They have different sizes kind of body. And so what is the best one in this population? So let's assume a normal bell curve where the majority of the population is in the middle, and then we have a couple of extremes like super short tails and super long tails. And so what's going to happen over time is that the super short tails aren't an advantage because they don't have these lizards balance up in the trees, and so the ones with the shorter tails sometimes fall out of the trees and die. And the ones with the longer tails get grabbed by their predators and the things that are chasing them down easier because there's more of them to grab. And so it's an advantage to be in the middle. And so the ones that are in the middle reproduce more. And so what we start to see is that bell curve shrinks and gets pointier at the top because more and more of the population is moving towards that average size. So this is known as stabilizing selection, okay, where we move towards the middle. All right, let's look at another example. What about these shells here, clam shells in shallow water? Well, I wish I could draw a picture. I should have gotten one of my dry erase boards. But in this situation, we've got these 3 different shell colors here, dark shells, average, and then a lighter shell. Well, the lighter shells have a better chance of survival in shallow water with a lot of sunlight on it, whereas the dark ones would stand out in the bright sunlight. At the same time, where it's shady, the dark-colored shells are the ones that have the advantage, and so they have a chance of surviving there. So we have 2 different variations of the same population that have a chance of survival. The one that's in the middle is actually a disadvantage because it doesn't survive well in the bright water because it gets eaten there, and it doesn't survive well in the dark water because it's too bright. And so what happens is that normal bell curve actually inverts, and we start to see more and more of the population on either end of the spectrum. And so those populations will begin to split from each other, and this is known as disrupted selection. Okay. All right, last one. So we've got giraffe necks. Okay, well, obviously, you could tell, because we're talking about giraffes, the giraffes with the longer neck have the advantage because they can reach into the high trees and get the food that nobody else can. So short necks don't survive. Even average necks don't survive. The best chance of survival is to have a really long neck, and the longer neck you have, the better chance you have of survival. So the entire population was here in the middle, and now it's moving. Okay, it's moving towards one extreme version of that trait. So that's known as directional selection. So again, 3 types of natural selection. Still all natural selection, but it's based on the type of trait that we're talking about. Okay. Now, what causes, what's one of the major causes for this evolution to take place, this natural selection to occur? One of the big ones is isolation. In other words, that a population becomes isolated from the rest of the population, and so it only reproduces within that group. So here's a good example. We've got this group of bugs. For some reason, they get separated maybe by a giant flood or something like that. So you can see in the populations to begin with, right here in the second picture, we have light-colored and dark-colored in both populations, but for one reason or another, because of their environment, up here, darker shells have a better chance of survival. Down here, lighter shells have a better chance of survival. Well, if they're separated from each other for a long enough period of time, they become their own species because they can only reproduce with that group. So even if I take that barrier away, now they are able to intermingle again, they are still 2 different species, and they can still no longer reproduce with one another because they've been separated and isolated for such a long period of time. And so this is one of the mechanisms that drives natural selection, one of the things that causes natural selection to occur. Now, there's different types of isolation. The easiest one to identify is geographic. In other words, there becomes like a physical geographic barrier between you and the rest of your population. A good example is when Pangea broke up, you know what I mean? Like we were all able to move around in this one landmass, but now it breaks apart and there's like a big ocean between us. So obviously we have 2 different populations that occur on either side of that. We can have reproductive isolation. In other words, when your species reproduces, what's your mating time? If you only have a mating time, if you only go look for mates in April, or if you only go look for mates in July, you're obviously not going to intermingle those different groups. And so if you only mate during those times, then you only have the option of mating with whoever's there. And so those become 2 different species. We can see this. This is kind of how frogs and toads and those different groups have become different species over time. Mechanical isolation, that's when within your species you have different versions that don't have the tools basically to fit together anymore. And we don't need to necessarily get into too much more of that. And then gametic. In other words, like your gametes don't match up. You don't have the right number of chromosomes in there anymore, and so sperm can't meet egg correctly, and you can't reproduce. All right, last one is behavioral isolation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the blue-footed boobies, but these are actually found on the Galapagos Islands. They're one of the things that Darwin noticed. But blue-footed boobies are separated from the other versions of the same type of bird because they have a specific type of behavior that they use in order to court their mates. And so if you have a different type of courting ritual, that might isolate you from the rest of the population as well. Speciation, this is the process by which new species are formed. Again, you have one population, a barrier is produced, there's isolation that occurs, and now you get two different species that can no longer reproduce. And again, I keep using that phrase, no longer able to reproduce. That's based on the biological species concept. So it's the idea that you are considered a species if you can only reproduce with those of you that are the same type. So that's why dogs are called breeds, because all those different breeds can still reproduce, but yet if you look at like birds, those aren't breeds, those are species of birds because they can't reproduce with one another. Okay? A good example here is lions and tigers. Lions and tigers used to be the same species, but because of geographic isolation, where tigers moved into the jungles and lions stayed in the savannas, they started to split and become two different species. But they're still closely enough related that they can produce an offspring. Right here, a liger right in the middle, or a tigon if it's a male tiger and a female lion. But the difference is that their offspring, the reason lions and tigers are still considered different species, their offspring cannot reproduce. Ligers are infertile. The same thing occurs in donkeys and horses. They can create a mule, but that can't reproduce. Even goats and sheep, same thing. Okay, they can produce an offspring, but that offspring itself cannot reproduce. It's infertile, so those are considered different species now. Now, if they continue to be isolated from each other, they won't even be able to reproduce after a certain period of time. Those ligers will no longer exist on this planet. Interesting. Ligers don't exist in nature. They only occur in captivity. Okay, keep moving on. Types of evolution. In other words, like, what direction is evolution moving? It's called divergent evolution if you were the same species, but now you're becoming more and more dissimilar. Lions and tigers are a good example of that. They were once the same thing. There was isolation that occurs. They're splitting and going in opposite directions, and so they're becoming more and more dissimilar. So they're diverging from one another, even though they still technically can make an offspring. So that's divergent. Another good example, African and Indian elephants, chimps and humans. It's caused by speciation. Okay? Convergent is the opposite. In other words, like, we are two completely different species, but we have traits that look very similar to one another, and we start to look like the same thing. But what's important here is that they will never be the same thing, okay? Sharks and dolphins look really similar. They have a lot of the same traits, but they will never be able to reproduce. So why do they have the same traits? Well, that's because those are the traits that give you the best chance of survival in that environment, and specifically here, the open ocean. Okay. And then last one is coevolution. This is the idea that you evolve in response to one another. Rabbits and hawks. Rabbits get faster, hawks get faster. Rabbits have camouflage, hawks get better eyesight. They are continually responding to one another. Bees and flowers. Flowers produce brighter colors, sweeter nectar, etc. to get to these bees to come over and pollinate them. And cheetahs and gazelles, that's another good one. Okay, cheetahs get faster, so the gazelles have to get faster, so the gazelles have to learn how to turn on a dime. They are responding to one another naturally. It's not something that they're choosing, it's just they have those traits. How fast evolution can occur, and I know we're a lot of information coming in here quickly. There's two theories about how fast evolution occurs. The first one is called gradualism. In other words, there's teeny tiny changes over millions of years in order to become different. The other one is punctuated equilibrium. This is the idea that there's a major event that occurs and it causes big changes, or it causes a large portion of the population to be wiped out, and so those are the only ones that are left behind. So, again, we've covered a ton here, but we've really gotten into the meat, of what makes evolution the thing that it is and what drives it and all the different types of evidence that lead us there. And that's actually what we're going to pick up next time, is talking about the evidence of evolution and how we actually know that this is actually the way that it works. So, again, hope you learned something. Feel free to contact or reach out if you have questions, but I look forward to hearing from you, and I'll see you next time for Section 5. Have a great day.